activity-based costing. This is the second method of costing which we will look at, and is from examination point of view and from the classroom environment point of view. This is not very different than absorption costing, which we learned in the last week. So you will see that there are quite a few similarities. However, in realities, activity-based costing system is very different than absorption costing. We'll look at some of the theory, and then we will have we'll have a short question on activity-based costing to link the theory with numbers. So we looked at absorption costing last 2 weeks, and I have highlighted that the main problem in costing is overheads. And to deal with those overheads accurately, there are quite a few different techniques available, and activity-based costing is the one which tries to look at overheads as the incur, as we spend them on different products and different unit of services. It tries not to make any random apportionment, the one we have seen in absorption costing. We have seen that we would do apportionment on the basis of labor hours. So we will assume that because labor was working in the factory, the overheads we incurred were because of that, and then the longer a product takes to make, more overheads it will absorb. And similarly with machine hours, the same assumption is made. In activity-based costing, we don't make an assumption. Well, most of the time, or for the biggest proportion. Activity-based costing looks at all of the activities which are carried out within the organization, and those activities are called cost pools. We looked at a question which was Druri's, and if you look at the segregation of those overheads, they were setup cost, maintenance cost, engineering, and packaging, something like this. So those were the activities in that organization. So what activity-based costing would do, they would identify all of those activities, and then they would call them cost pools, and then all of the costs which were incurred to set up, which was incurred to take the orders, which were incurred to dispatch the orders, which were incurred to maintain machines in different departments, and so on and so on. So they would pool all of those costs together, direct and indirect, and then they would link those costs to each product or each unit of service we provide. And this way we can allocate and apportion the cost not on the basis of an assumption, but an actual record of an activity. What basically does, each activity is linked with a certain product, and that is only possible now in the last 20 years since the introduction of information technology. Before that, ABC was not possible. It's cost pools and cost drivers. So I gave you an example of a cost pool of setup cost. Setup cost is a cost pool, and each time a setup is created, that cost is driven higher. So a setup is a driver to increase costs related to setups. Yeah. So we discussed what setups means. Those setups are related to each batch we create when different batches are produced in a factory of Coke, for example. Activity-based costing. If you look at absorption costing is going to have few numbers of departments in a factory or in a company. Or it's going to have few numbers of products in a factory. Maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30. But when it comes to activity-based costing, we are going to create hundreds of cost pool within an organization. So the more detailed knowledge of each cost, why it is incurred, and to which product or unit of service is related, that's what activity-based costing does. So in classroom, you'll see very little difference, but in reality it's very different. So what happens in absorption costing, we created total overheads for each department, and then we knew how many machine hours or labor hours are being worked there, and then we calculated a departmental OAR. In activity-based costing, we will have all of the overheads. We will allocate and apportion them as per the activities to the cost pools. and then we will see how many cost drivers were there, not departmental hours, but the cost drivers, and then we will calculate rate per driver. And then we will see that this product took 10 drivers of this activity, so we will allocate the cost accordingly. This product took 20 drivers of each cost, and accordingly we will have. So in reality, we could have like hundreds of cost pools, hundreds of cost drivers, and then all drivers are being allocated to different activities. Why activity-based costing was needed? I have mentioned this before, that overheads are a bigger proportion of the total cost now. If a type of cost is bigger in promotion, it's more significant. And if we get that wrong, then we will get the costing wrong, and hence we will get the pricing wrong, and then the profitability of each product or department will be incorrect. So now it is needed because of that reason. Indirect costs in the past were relatively small when we were doing absorption costing. Mostly it was direct cost. Labor cost was a bigger chunk of the total cost. In the past, around 20-30 years ago, collecting information was very difficult. It was almost impossible to relate every single activity which is carried out in an organization and then relate it to a certain product. It was almost impossible. Now it is possible. Another reason for that is that why do we need to get costing right now? It's more important to get it right now because if we are working in a very competitive environment right now, and our focus is more now on to reduce the cost. In the past, before globalization, organizations would produce goods, they would set a cost, and they would sell it because there was very little competition. Now, first thing they think about before even starting the product, the first thing they think of is how much price customer is willing to pay, and what will be the cost of producing that unit, and can we actually achieve that? And this brings in the concept of target costing, which we will discuss sometime in this module. But now, because there's more competition, costing has become more important, and our whole thinking about costing has changed. Before we would not worry about costing, but now we need to worry about costing. And again, in the past, in each factory there were limited range of products were produced. Now more diverse, so it's more difficult to use absorption costing and get more accurate figures. Activity-based costing can answer all these questions. I have worked in BMW, and BMW every time they insert or they fix a part in the car, they scan it. So every separate element, every separate part is actually scanned, and then it is attached to that specific product. This helps them to identify that these all parts and these all activities are linked with this certain model, hence getting the right cost and then setting the right price. Another example, think about a consulting firm, maybe a product designing, maybe a website designing, some audit firms, tax advisory firms. They could use a software where every time they would search on different clients, even solicitors can use this, they would log in on the system for that specific client. And that software is going to record all of their hours, all of that time they use on a certain product, on a certain client. And this would, they can actually calculate the exact time of how long it took them on a certain product or a client, and then they can fix a price. So with IT it is possible. Obviously before that it was not as simple. Activity-based costing is not cheap. It costs millions of pounds to implement activity-based costing in an organization like BMW. What does it do? When we carry out this investigation, that okay, let's step number one. What are the activities which are carried out in the organization? This helps us not just to get the costing right, but it helps us to understand the organization better as well. So that has so many other advantages as well. It helps us to think from that perspective that the costs could be reduced. They are not something which we have to have the way they are. It can change the thinking of the management. It's very costly to implement, especially on the IT. Activity-based costing, as the research shows, has caused a lot of resistance. There are so many organizations who initiated activity-based costing in their organization, and then they abandon the project because of the staff resistance. Most of us don't like to be observed when we are doing things, and that's one of the reasons. It still uses apportionment to establish activity costs. There are some costs which are common costs still, so again there are some sort of assumption is made in some cost, but the proportion of that is much smaller than absorption costing. It can be more complex than previous system. Absorption costing, if a manager wants to understand how my products are being costed, they can easily understand. But in activity-based costing, a manager from a non-financial background would find it very difficult to understand this concept. And the last point is that activity-based costing helps us to get correct costing, but it costs a lot of money. We need to think about cost versus benefit analysis. If the benefit is higher, then yes, it's worth it, but sometimes it's not worth it. And if you look at the research on activity-based costing, the evidence supports both sides. Some of the organizations who have adopted activity-based costing, they found massive inaccuracies in their costing. Some of the products which they thought are making profits were actually making loss, and vice versa. And some found it extremely useless. So that was a waste of money for them, because it didn't add value to the whole process. Because it's not just costing; it's the overall better understanding of the business activities as well.